3 years ago, I walked out of the Mactan-Cebu International Airport with a $415,000 nest egg in my accounts and the absolute, unshakable belief that I was the luckiest 63-year-old man on the face of the earth. I thought I'd finally beaten the system. Today, I'm sitting in a humid, sparse studio apartment looking at a bank balance of exactly $842. That's it. That's all that's left of 40 years crawling through attics and basements in a Michigan cold. The woman I called my wife for 30 months, the woman I believed was my second spring, is living in a Western-style villa that I designed, I built, and I paid every cent for. And she isn't alone. She's there with a man she spent 2.5 years introducing to me as her brother. I knew she was 33 years younger than me. I heard the stories. I saw the warnings. I read the forums. But I sat there and convinced myself that my money was just the entry fee for a genuine love I deserved after a lifetime of hard work. I thought I was the exception to every rule you've ever heard about retiring in Southeast Asia. If you're sitting there right now thinking you're too sharp, too professional, or too rational to end up in a chair like this, then you're the primary target. You're the one who needs to hear the cold, hard truth about how a calculated exit strategy becomes a total collapse. Because it doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't start with a giant red flag. It happens one reasonable decision at a time, until the foundation is gone and you're just waiting for the roof to cave in. To understand how I lost it all, we have to go back to Grand Rapids, before the first wire transfer, when I still thought I was the one in control of the thermostat. To understand how I ended up sitting in this humid studio with nothing but a plastic folder and a few $100s, you have to understand the man I was back in Grand Rapids. I wasn't some dreamer or a guy who lived on credit. I was a man who spent 40 years crawling through the tightest, coldest attics and the dampest, most claustrophobic basements in Michigan. I built a business from one truck and a set of wrenches into a reputable HVAC company. I knew how to read a blueprint, I knew how to manage a crew, and I knew exactly how much every BTU of cooling was going to cost a customer. I was a man of systems, budgets, and hard work. By the time I hit 63, I had done everything right by the American playbook. I had exactly $415,000 in my 401k. I had a modest pension and a 3-bedroom ranch in Michigan that was completely paid off, valued at $275,000 at the time. I wasn't wealthy in the way people on TV are, but I was comfortable. I was the guy you called when the furnace died at 2 a.m. in a blizzard, and I always showed up. But there was a slow leak in my life that no amount of professional success could patch. My wife of 32 years, my high school sweetheart, and I had divorced 8 years prior. It wasn't a blowout or a scandal. The spark just vanished into the routine of raising kids and running the shop. After the divorce, and after the kids moved to different states, that big house started feeling like a warehouse for old furniture and silence. My kids would call once a month, usually while they were driving to work, and I realized that in America, once you're retired and your primary utility to the world is gone, you become invisible. You're just another gray-haired guy at the hardware store who takes a little too long to find the right copper fitting. I didn't want a nurse. I didn't want to spend the next 20 years waiting for the snow to melt just so I could go to a diner and talk about my blood pressure with other guys who were also waiting to die. I wanted to be seen again. I wanted to feel like a man of means and vitality, not a retired contractor whose best years were buried in a crawl space. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in February, 3 years ago, while I was sitting at my kitchen table in Grand Rapids. The outside temp was 4 degrees, and the wind was rattling the storm windows I'd installed myself a decade earlier. I opened a utility bill, $382 for 1 month of heat and electricity for a house where I only used 3 rooms. I sat there looking at that number. Then I looked at the snow piling up on the driveway that I was going to have to shovel at 6 in the morning just to go to the grocery store. And I felt this heavy, cold realization sink into my bones. I was 63 years old. I had worked 40 years to own this patch of dirt, and my reward was paying a fortune just to keep from freezing to death in a house that felt like a tomb. That was the night I stopped just browsing the Expat forums and started treating the Philippines like a major commercial contract. I'm a contractor. I don't move a single piece of equipment until I've seen the specs and checked the local codes. I spent the next 18 months doing my due diligence. I had spreadsheets. I tracked the exchange rate of the peso for a year. I looked at the cost of high-speed internet, the the quality of hospitals in Cebu, and the price of a gallon of milk in Lapu-Lapu City. The math was undeniable. In Michigan, my $2,400 in Social Security was a survival budget. It covered the property taxes, the insurance, the heating, and maybe a modest dinner out once a week. In the Philippines, that same $2,400 would make me a king. I could hire a driver, have a full-time housekeeper, and eat at the best restaurants in the city every single night, and I'd still be putting money into savings. It wasn't about being rich, it was about the ROI on my life. For a man who spent his life calculating heat loads and energy efficiency, it was the most rational move I'd ever seen on paper. And then there was Elena. We'd been talking for 6 months by then. She was 33, a schoolteacher, or so the profile said. She was articulate, seemingly modest, and she listened to me in a way no one had in a decade. She didn't ask for money. She asked about my day. She asked about the business I'd built. To a man who felt like he was becoming a ghost in his own hometown, that attention was more intoxicating than any drug. I knew the statistics. I knew the 33-year age gap was a massive red flag in any other context. But I sat there in the Michigan winter, looking at my bank balance, and I convinced myself that my money wasn't just savings. It was the entry fee for a genuine love I deserved after a lifetime of hard work. I convinced myself that because I was a man of systems, I could control the variables. I thought I was the exception to every rule you've ever heard. I'd seen the warnings about green card hunters and gold diggers. I'd read the horror stories. But I approached Elena the same way I'd approach a new supplier. I looked for inconsistencies. She didn't ask me for a dime. When I offered to send her a new phone because hers had a cracked screen, she refused. She told me she was a schoolteacher and she took pride in her independence. She'd send me photos of her classroom, and we'd talk for hours about my kids, my business, and the things I'd built with my hands. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't the HVAC guy or the old man down the street. I was Gary. I was a man who had something to offer. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Gary, she was 30 years younger. How could you be so blind? But you have to understand the logic I was using. I told myself that in a culture like that, stability is the ultimate aphrodisiac. I figured she wanted security, and I wanted to be seen. It was a fair trade, a professional agreement between two consenting adults. I wasn't looking for a fairy tale. I was looking for a partnership where the entry fee was a lifestyle I could easily afford. My kids didn't understand. They saw the age gap, and they saw the distance, and they reacted with that typical American skepticism. But they weren't the ones sitting in a cold house in Grand Rapids. They weren't the ones facing 20 more years of invisibility. I told them I'd done the math, and I had. I thought I'd accounted for every variable in the system. The final decision came when I put my house on the market. It sold in 4 days for $275,000. I looked at that check, and I looked at my $415,000 in the 401k, and I realized I had over $600,000 in liquid assets. In Michigan, that's a decent retirement. In Cebu, that's a legacy. I packed 40 years of my life into 6 boxes, sold my tools, and bought a one-way ticket to Mactan-Cebu International. I walked onto that plane feeling like the smartest man in the room. I had a plan, I had the funds, and I had a woman waiting for me who made me feel like I was 35 again. I didn't realize that I was building my entire future on a site I hadn't even surveyed in person yet. I was so focused on the specs of the house that I didn't even notice the ground was already starting to shift beneath my feet. When I stepped out of that terminal, the air hit me like the exhaust from a massive commercial boiler, thick, wet, and smelling of diesel mixed with something sweet, like overripe fruit. It was 88 degrees at 8 in the evening. In Grand Rapids, I'd left behind a world of gray slush and salt-corroded trucks. Here, the world felt like it was in Technicolor. And Elena was standing there, right where she said she'd be, holding a sign that just said Gary with a little heart drawn next to it. She looked exactly like she did on the screen, only smaller, more delicate. When she hugged me, she smelled like jasmine and coconut oil. I'd spent 40 years fixing other people's climates. Now, for the first time, I was living in one that didn't require a furnace to keep me from shivering. The first 3 months felt like I'd cheated the laws of physics. I'd set up a test site in a high-end condo in Lapu-Lapu City, a 2-bedroom unit with a balcony overlooking the Hilitungan Channel, granite countertops, and a split-system AC in every room that actually worked. The rent was $750 a month, fully furnished. In Michigan, my property taxes and heating bill alone were almost that much. I was eating fresh grilled lapu-lapu and drinking cold San Miguel beers at seaside restaurants where the entire bill for two people rarely cracked $35. My $2,400 in Social Security wasn't just covering the overhead, it was a king's ransom. For the first time in my life, I didn't look at the right side of the menu first. I just ordered what I wanted. But it wasn't just the money. It was the way I was treated. In Grand Rapids, I was a retired contractor with bad knees. In Cebu, walking down the street with Elena on my arm, I felt like a man of consequence. People were polite. They addressed me as Sir Gary, and Elena was attentive in a way that felt almost surgical. She knew how I liked my coffee before I even asked. She'd notice if I was squinting and bring me my sunglasses. I told myself this was the traditional culture I'd read about on the forums. I felt essential. I felt like the hero of my own movie. The first maintenance issue cropped up about 4 months in. We were having dinner when Elena's phone rang. She stepped away, and when she came back, her eyes were red. She told me her mother had been rushed to the hospital in the province, an urgent gallbladder surgery. The cost was 150,000 pesos, about $3,000. She wasn't asking me for the money. She was crying because she didn't have it and didn't know how her family would survive the debt. I didn't even hesitate. To me, $3,000 was a rounding error in my 401k, but to her, it was life or death. I went to the ATM the next morning and handed her the cash. The look of pure, unadulterated gratitude she gave me was better than any drug. I wasn't just a guy paying bills anymore. I was a provider. I was the man who saved the family. Shortly after that, I met June. Elena introduced him as her older brother who had been working in Manila and had just moved back to Cebu to help look after their parents. June was in his late 30s, quiet, and incredibly handy. He'd come over to the condo and help me with small things, fixing a leaky faucet the building maintenance ignored, or driving us to the market. I liked June. He didn't speak much English, but he worked hard and he seemed to respect me. I felt like I wasn't just getting a wife. I was getting a family unit. I was building a crew. By the 6-month mark, I'd moved from testing the lifestyle to full-scale production. Everything in my spreadsheet was checking out. My costs were low, my quality of life was at an all-time high, and I had a woman who seemed to adore me. I was so busy looking at the profit and loss statement of my new life that I didn't notice the foundation was starting to settle unevenly. I didn't question why a schoolteacher had so much free time, or why June seemed to know exactly how to play on my pride as a fellow tradesman. I was ready to double down. I was ready to build something permanent. The real turning point, the moment the project went from a manageable risk to a structural failure, started with the check from selling the ranch in Grand Rapids. $260,000 after fees. I sat in my condo in Lapu-Lapu, looking at that number on my laptop screen, and I felt invincible. Between that and my 401k, I had over $675,000 liquid. In Cebu, that's enough to change the destiny of an entire bloodline. And that's exactly what I set out to do, though I told myself I was just securing my retirement. Elena started talking about the forever home. She told me she hated seeing me pay $750 a month in rent to a developer when we could build something that belonged to us. She found a piece of land 2 hours north in a town called Katmon, sloped, overlooking the ocean, surrounded by palm trees. It was exactly the kind of place a man who spent 40 years in Michigan basements dreams about when he's shivering at a bus stop. But here's where the first structural crack appeared. As a foreigner, I couldn't own the land. I knew this. I'd read the laws. The transfer certificate of title, or the TCT, had to be in a Filipino name. Elena suggested we put the land in her name, and I'd pay for the construction. To my contractor brain, this sounded like a standard partnership. I even went to a local lawyer who drew up a long-term lease and a debt agreement that supposedly protected my investment. I spent $3,000 on that lawyer just to feel like I was being rational. I told myself I was being smart, covering my bases, but the truth was I was just paying for a piece of paper to silence my own intuition. Before we even broke ground, there was the land debt. Elena told me her family had a dispute over the taxes on the plot, and if we didn't pay $5,000 immediately, the government would seize it. Again, $5,000 was nothing to me. It was a couple of furnace installs. I wired the money. Elena cried, thanked me, and told me I was the anchor of her life. When a woman 30 years younger tells you you're her anchor, you don't look for the leak in the boat. You just start rowing harder. Then came the construction. This was my world. I spent $140,000 building a Western-style villa, poured concrete, reinforced rebar that could withstand a Category 5 typhoon, American standard electrical with a backup generator, and a central AC system I designed myself. I was the master builder of Katmon. Every day, I'd drive up there with June. June was the foreman, or so I thought. He managed the local crews, handled the deliveries, and made sure no one was skimming the cement. I liked June more than ever during those months. We'd sit on the unfinished porch, drinking warm sodas, and he'd nod at my blueprints like I was some kind of visionary. He'd say, "Sir Gary, you build for 100 years." It made me feel essential. It made me feel powerful. But the overhead was creeping up. Every week, there was a new emergency. A cousin needed a motorbike for work. An uncle's roof collapsed. Elena's sister needed tuition. It was always small amounts, 300 here, 500 there. But when I looked at my ledger, I realized my lifestyle costs had jumped from $1,500 a month to nearly $2,500. I was spending more than my Social Security check. I was dipping into the principal. When I brought it up to Elena, she'd get quiet. She'd say, "Gary, in my culture, if one person has a feast, the whole village eats. You're our family now." She made it feel like a moral obligation. She made me feel like if I stopped the cash flow, I was failing as a husband. And I didn't want to fail. I wanted to be the hero. The house was finished in 14 months. It was a masterpiece, granite floors, a wraparound deck, and a master suite that looked straight out of a luxury magazine. The day we moved in, we had a huge party for the whole neighborhood. I paid for it all. I sat there in my Hawaiian shirt, watching 100 people I didn't know eat food I'd paid for, and I thought, I've made it. I've finally won. But the moment the last tile was laid and the last inspection was passed, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It was like a furnace with a cracked heat exchanger. It still looked fine on the outside, but the air inside was becoming toxic. Elena was suddenly busy all the time. She had to go to the city for teacher seminars. She had to visit her mother in the province. The intimacy that had been the entry fee for my six-figure investment vanished overnight. I went from being her anchor to being the guy who sat in the living room and paid the electric bill. I spent 6 months in what I call the gray zone. I was living as a ghost in a house I designed and paid for. I tried to talk to her, and she'd just look at her phone. If I asked where the money was going, she'd accuse me of controlling her. June was still around, but he wasn't handy anymore. He'd just sit in the outdoor kitchen, smoking and staring at me. I started feeling like an intruder in my own life. I'd look at the granite floors and the central AC, and I'd realize that I'd built a beautiful cage and locked myself inside it with the very people who were waiting for me to run out of breath. The discovery happened because I decided to be a romantic. I'd gone to Cebu City for a 2-day supply run, but I decided to come back a night early to surprise Elena with a piece of jewelry I'd bought at Ayala Mall, a gold necklace with a small diamond pendant that cost me $1,150. I drove up the coast in the dark, feeling that old Michigan contractor's pride as I saw the lights of my villa shining on the hill from a mile away. I let myself in through the side door I'd installed myself. The house was quiet, but the AC was humming, my AC. I walked into the master bedroom, expecting to find Elena asleep, but she wasn't alone. And the man in my bed, in the house I built, on the land I paid for, wasn't a brother. It was June. He didn't jump. He didn't scramble for his clothes. He just squinted at the light, looked at me, and then reached for a cigarette on the nightstand, my nightstand. Elena sat up slowly. She didn't scream. She didn't even look surprised. She looked bored. "Gary," she said, her voice flat, like she was reading a grocery list. "You were supposed to be in the city until tomorrow." "What is this?" I managed to choke out. My voice sounded thin, like it was coming through a pinhole. "What the hell is he doing in our bed?" June lit the cigarette. The smell of cheap tobacco filled the room I'd spent $40,000 finishing. He blew the smoke toward the ceiling and said something in Cebuano that I didn't understand, but the tone told me everything. He wasn't the handy brother anymore. He was the owner of the room. "Get out," I said, stepping toward the bed. "June, get the hell out of my house." June didn't move. He just looked at Elena. "Gary, stop," she said. She walked over to the dresser, picked up a heavy manila envelope, and tossed it onto the bed. It is not your house. Look at the paper. I paid for this, I shouted. My hands were shaking so hard, I dropped the blue velvet box. It hit the floor with a soft thud. $140,000 for the construction, $5,000 for the land debt. I have the lease. I have the debt agreement. The lease is for 25 years, Gary, she said, her eyes cold as Michigan ice. But the TCT, the title, is in my name. Always in my name. And the debt agreement you signed? June's cousin is the notary who signed it. It is not registered with the province. It is just a piece of paper for an old man to feel safe. I felt the floor tilt. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed my laptop. I logged into our joint local account, the one where I kept the operating expenses. It had been $22,000 when I left for the city 48 hours ago. Now, the balance showed exactly 412 pesos, about $7. I checked my U.S. account, the one linked to my 401k withdrawals. There were 3 unauthorized wire transfers made that afternoon, totaling $38,000. She'd found the secondary password I kept in the safe I'd installed in the master closet. I went back to the bedroom, the room spinning. You took it all, you and him, for 3 years. All of it was a lie. Elena leaned against the doorframe. She looked at June, then back at me. You wanted to be the hero, Gary. You wanted to feel like a big man. I let you. But heroes don't stay forever. They just pay for the movie and then they leave. I reached for my phone to call the police, but June was off the bed in a second. He didn't hit me. He just grabbed my wrist and took the phone out of my hand. He looked at Elena, and she nodded. If you call the police, she said softly, I will tell them you hit me. I will tell them you are an old man who is confused and violent. My family is the police in this town, Gary. My uncle is the captain. Who will they believe? The foreigner with the empty pockets, or the woman who owns the land? I looked at the two of them, the second spring and her brother, standing in the house that had cost me my life's work. I realized then that I wasn't the master builder. I was just the material. I was the lumber and the concrete they needed to build their life. I didn't fight. I couldn't. The system had suffered a total, catastrophic failure. There was no backup generator. There was no bypass valve. I walked out of that bedroom, through the living room, and out the side door. I didn't even take my clothes. I just got back into the Tucson, the only thing still in my name, and I drove. I drove until the sun started to come up over the coast, and I realized I didn't have enough gas to get back to Cebu City. I pulled over near a small sari-sari store, checked my wallet, and found 3 $20 bills and a few hundred pesos. I sat there on the side of the road, watching the locals walk to work in the heat, and it finally hit me. I was 66 years old. I had exactly $842 left in the world. I had no house in Michigan, no business, and no family that wanted to hear, I told you so. I had ignored every blueprint, every warning light, and every professional instinct I'd honed over 40 years because I wanted to believe the air was sweet when it was actually poisoned. The project wasn't just over. It was demolished. And as I sat there in the humid morning air, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. I was the one who had pulled the permit for my own destruction. I'm sitting right now in a 12 by 12 studio apartment in a part of Cebu City that tourists never visit. The walls are thin enough that I can hear my neighbor's TV through the concrete, and the only window looks out at a rusted corrugated roof and a tangle of power lines. I have exactly $842 left in the world and a cheap plastic folder containing a one-way flight reservation to Detroit. My sister back in Grand Rapids had to wire me the $3,000 for the ticket because my accounts are drained to the bone. At 66 years old, after 40 years of working until my knees gave out, I'm going back to live in a spare bedroom and look for a part-time job at a hardware store just to buy groceries. I'm starting over from zero, and the only thing I'm taking home is the weight of what I allowed to happen to myself. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this so you don't end up in a 12 by 12 room with a plastic folder. When you're sitting in the cold back home, looking at those beautiful photos of tropical beaches and smiling women, your brain starts to shut down the safety valves. You start ignoring the warning lights because you want the dream to be real. But I've learned 3 things the hard way. Things that weren't in the forums and weren't in the YouTube videos. First, you have to understand that the hero complex is a high-interest debt you can never repay. When I paid $3,000 for Elena's mother's surgery and $5,000 for that land debt, I felt like a savior. I thought I was building a foundation of love, but I wasn't. If you're in a situation where you are constantly solving someone's financial problems just to keep the peace, you aren't in a relationship. You're a venture capitalist in a failing business. And in that world, the investor is always the first one to get wiped out. If you have to pay to be the hero, the story is always going to end in a tragedy for you. Second, you need to realize that in this culture, the family is a closed circuit, and you are just the external power supply. Elena's loyalty was never to me. It was to her bloodline. June wasn't a villain in her eyes. He was the partner who helped her secure the future of the clan. To them, I was a resource to be harvested like a field of sugarcane. Once the harvest was in, once the house was built and the accounts were dry, there was no more use for the equipment. Don't think for a second that your marriage certificate overrides 25 years of cultural conditioning. You are a guest in their world, and guests are eventually expected to leave their gifts and go home. Finally, understand that a 33-year age gap isn't just a number. It's a language barrier you'll never bridge. I was playing a game called Romance, looking for a second spring. Elena was playing a game called Survival, looking for a life raft. When those two games collide, the person playing for survival will always win because they have more to lose. She wasn't different or special. She was a woman doing a job that she'd been trained for by the reality of her life long before I ever landed in Cebu. You can't win a game when the person across the table is playing for their life while you're just playing for a feeling. If you're sitting where I was 3 years ago, looking at your bank account and feeling like life is passing you by, I'm not telling you to stay home. I'm telling you to leave your ego at the border. If she's 30 years younger, she's not different. She's doing a job. If you can't accept that, you'll end up like me, 66 years old, starting over from zero. Don't let your desire to be seen make you go blind. If you want to know the actual legal steps I should have taken to protect myself, watch the next video on this channel about the trust agreement and why even that might not save you.